Margaret Ellis used to say that a house could remember laughter. She believed it the way some people believe in gravity, quietly, without question. She believed the walls absorbed the sound of children running down hallways. The kitchen cabinets held on to whispered secrets. And the staircase knew the weight of every exhausted step a mother ever took at the end of a long day. For 32 years, her house had remembered everything. And then one day, it remembered silence. It started small. Margaret didn't notice the shift at first. She was 71, still sharp, still independent, still waking before sunrise out of habit. Her husband, Daniel, had been gone for 3 years. The mornings were lonelier now, but she filled them the same way she always had, coffee brewed strong, curtains opened wide, the radio murmuring soft classical music in the background. She still set out 3 mugs sometimes. She didn't mean to. It was muscle memory. Her son Andrew used to stumble into the kitchen half asleep, hair a mess, asking if there were any clean socks. Her daughter Claire would sit at the table with her textbooks, pretending to study but really scrolling through her phone when Margaret wasn't looking. Now the table sat untouched. Andrew lived 20 minutes away. Claire was in the next town over. Close enough. That's what Margaret told herself. Close enough means you'll visit often. Close enough means I won't grow old alone. The first time she felt it, the shift, was when Andrew canceled Sunday dinner. He never missed Sunday dinner. "Mom, I can't make it this week," he said over the phone. His voice sounded rushed, distracted. "The kids have soccer, and Jenna's got a work thing." "Oh," Margaret replied lightly, forcing brightness into her tone. "Of course. That's all right. We can do next week." There was a pause. "Actually, next week might be tough too. We're just really busy lately." "Busy?" Margaret smiled even though he couldn't see it. "That's good. Busy is good." After they hung up, she stood in the kitchen staring at the roast she had already seasoned. She wrapped it in foil and placed it in the freezer. It was just one Sunday. Things change. Children grow up. She understood that. Or at least she told herself she did. Claire started coming by less often too. "I've just got so much going on, Mom," Claire would say. "Work's insane. And with the commute, I'm exhausted by the time I get home." Margaret would nod, even over the phone. "Of course you are. You work too hard." She never said what she was thinking. "You used to tell me everything. Now I don't even know what your apartment looks like." The house grew quieter. The radio stayed off more often. Margaret found herself talking to Daniel's photograph in the hallway. "They're busy," she would tell him. "It's a different world now." She meant it. She wanted to mean it. The real change came the night she slipped. It was nothing dramatic. No flashing lights. No ambulance. She had been carrying laundry down the stairs when her slipper caught the edge of the step. She fell hard, landing on her side. The pain shot through her hip and shoulder. She lay there for a long moment, staring up at the ceiling. The house was quiet. Too quiet. She tried to stand but couldn't at first. Eventually, she managed to pull herself up using the railing. Her hip throbbed, but nothing felt broken. She sat at the kitchen table afterward, shaken more by the silence than the fall itself. For the first time, a thought crept in. What if I couldn't get up? She brushed it away. She wasn't helpless. She was still capable. The next morning, Andrew called. "Mom, Claire told me you fell." Margaret stiffened. "It was nothing." "You didn't tell me." There was nothing to tell. There was another pause on the line. "Mom, maybe it's time we talk about, you know, the house." Margaret's fingers tightened around the phone. "The house? It's big. It's a lot to manage. You're alone there." "I've been alone before," she said quietly. "That's not what I mean." But it was exactly what he meant. They came over that weekend. Andrew and Claire sat at the dining table where they had once done homework, where Margaret had once cut birthday cakes and wrapped Christmas presents. Now they sat across from her like careful negotiators. "Mom," Claire began gently, "we just worry about you." "I'm fine." "You fell." "I tripped." Andrew leaned forward. "It's not just about the fall. It's about practicality." Practicality. Margaret felt the word settle between them like dust. "We've been looking at some places," Claire continued. "There's a really nice senior community about 10 minutes from Andrew's house." "A community," Margaret repeated. "It's independent living," Andrew added quickly. "You'd have your own space. But there'd be staff, activities, people around." People around. Margaret glanced at Daniel's photograph on the wall. She didn't want people around. She wanted her children around. "I'm not ready for that," she said. Andrew exchanged a look with Claire. "We're not saying tomorrow," he said carefully. "But we need to think long term." Long term. Margaret had spent her entire life thinking long term. She had saved for their college funds when money was tight. She had taken extra shifts at the hospital. She had packed lunches, ironed uniforms, stayed up late helping with science projects. She had thought long-term for them. Now they were thinking long-term for her. And somehow, she was the problem to be solved. The weeks that followed felt different. Conversations shifted. Andrew started using phrases like downsizing and maintenance costs. Claire mentioned liquidity and property value. Margaret listened. She realized they weren't just worried. They were planning. One afternoon, she overheard Andrew in the backyard, speaking quietly to Claire. If she sells now, the market's good. We could use the equity to help with the kids' school tuition. Margaret froze behind the kitchen window. We could use the equity. Her house. Her life. An asset. She stepped back before they could see her. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling. Inconvenient. That was the word she began to feel in her bones. Not sick. Not helpless. Not incapable. Just inconvenient. Her existence complicated their schedules. Her house complicated their finances. Her aging complicated their neat, busy lives. The decision came faster than she expected. Andrew scheduled a tour of the senior community without asking her first. It's just to look, he said. No pressure. Margaret went. The building was clean. Bright. Smiling staff at the front desk. A piano in the lobby. Bulletin boards with watercolor classes and movie nights. It's lovely, Claire said. Margaret nodded. It was lovely. It also wasn't home. Her room, if she chose it, would be a small apartment with beige walls and a kitchenette. It's low maintenance, Andrew said. No stairs. No stairs. No garden. No creaky hallway that remembered laughter. She stood by the window of the model unit and looked out at the parking lot. Mom? Claire asked softly. Margaret forced a smile. It's practical. That word again. The house went on the market 2 months later. Margaret signed the papers with steady hands. Andrew handled most of it. He talked about closing dates and inspections. Claire discussed staging. Margaret packed boxes. She wrapped Daniel's old sweaters carefully. She found Andrew's childhood drawings in the attic, stick figures labeled Mom and Me. She found Claire's ballet slippers. She sat on the bedroom floor and cried for the first time in years. Not because she was afraid. Because she wasn't asked what she wanted. The move happened on a gray Tuesday morning. The movers carried out furniture that had witnessed decades. Margaret walked through each room one last time. Thank you, she whispered to the walls. The house didn't answer. At the senior community, her apartment was ready. Andrew set up her television. Claire stocked the refrigerator. There, Claire said brightly. See? It's cozy. Cozy. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed. Yes. It is. They stayed for an hour. Andrew checked his watch twice. The kids had practice. Claire had an early meeting. We'll come by Sunday, Andrew promised. Margaret nodded. Of course. When the door closed behind them, the silence felt different from the silence in her house. This silence didn't remember laughter. It had never heard it. The first weeks passed slowly. Margaret attended a watercolor class. She joined a book club. She smiled at the other residents. They all had similar stories. Children who were busy. Homes that were too much to manage. Margaret learned a new phrase. It was for the best. That's what everyone said. One evening, she called Andrew. I was thinking, maybe I could come over for dinner this Sunday. There was a pause. Mom, Sundays are kind of chaotic. The kids have games. I could come Saturday. Saturday we're at Jenna's parents' place. Oh. Another pause. Maybe next week? Margaret swallowed. Yes. Next week. Next week didn't come. Claire visited once, bringing flowers. We've just been swamped, she said apologetically. Margaret smiled. It's all right. It wasn't anger she felt. It was a slow realization. The move hadn't made her safer. It had made her easier to set aside. At least in the house, she had been a presence. Now she was a location. A place to visit when convenient. The word returned. Inconvenient. She began to notice things. Andrew stopped asking her advice. Claire stopped calling for recipes. The conversations grew shorter. How are you? Fine. Good. She started taking longer walks around the community garden. One afternoon, she met a woman named Eleanor. 83. Sharp eyes. Quick wit. Children? Eleanor asked during their first conversation. 2, Margaret said. Busy? Margaret smiled faintly. Very. Eleanor snorted softly. Mine were busy too. Until they needed something. Margaret looked at her. What do you mean? Eleanor shrugged. Life has a way of circling back. Margaret thought about that for days. Life circles back. It does. It always had, when Andrew struggled in college. He came home when Claire went through her divorce. She slept in Margaret's guest room for months. The house had always been open, always. Margaret began to ask herself a question she had avoided. If I hadn't fallen, would they have moved me? The answer sat heavy in her chest. Yes, the fall had just made it easier. The turning point came quietly. It was a Thursday afternoon when Andrew called. Mom, I wanted to talk to you about something. Margaret sensed it before he said it. The community fees, he began carefully. They're higher than we expected. Margaret listened. We were thinking, maybe it would make sense if we adjusted some of your savings. Just to help cover things long term. Adjusted, Margaret felt something inside her shift. Her savings, the money she had set aside for emergencies, for independence, for whose long term? She asked gently. There was silence on the other end. Mom, we're just trying to make this sustainable. Sustainable, she understood now. Her move hadn't just been about safety. It had been about control, convenience, management, and now, maintenance. She hung up politely. Then she sat in her small beige apartment and looked around. She was 71, not helpless, not confused, not incapable, inconvenient, yes, but still alive, still thinking, still choosing. That night, Margaret made a decision of her own. The next morning, she met with the financial advisor at the community office. She asked questions, she reviewed her accounts, she made changes, quiet ones, intentional ones. She began volunteering at the local library twice a week. She started tutoring children in reading. She made friends, real ones. She stopped waiting by the phone on Sundays. When Andrew called 2 weeks later, she answered warmly but briefly. I can't talk long, she said. I'm heading out. Oh? Where? Book club. There was surprise in his voice. Margaret smiled. Life circles back, and sometimes, when you become inconvenient, you learn something powerful. You learn that your worth was never supposed to depend on someone else's schedule. Months passed. Andrew visited once. Hurried as usual. Claire came by on a rainy afternoon. They noticed changes. Margaret seemed lighter, more certain. Mom, Claire said cautiously one day, are you happy here? Margaret thought carefully before answering. I'm learning to be. That was the truth. Happiness wasn't the same as comfort, and comfort wasn't the same as belonging. She still missed her house, she always would, but she no longer missed being asked to shrink herself for convenience. The final shift came unexpectedly. Andrew lost his job. The call came late at night. Mom, he said, voice tight. I don't know what to do. Margaret listened. She didn't say I told you so. She didn't mention equity or practicality. She listened the way she always had. You can come by tomorrow, she said gently. We'll figure it out. He came the next day. He sat in her small beige living room, shoulders slumped, for the first time in a long while. He looked like her little boy again. I'm scared, he admitted. Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. I know. He glanced around the apartment. I didn't realize how small it was. Margaret held his gaze. It's enough. There was something unspoken in the air, regret, recognition, maybe even shame. Mom, did we rush you into this? She could have said yes. She could have listed every moment she felt pushed aside. Instead, she said something else. You were trying to solve a problem. He nodded slowly. But I wasn't a problem, she added softly. Andrew looked down. I'm sorry. Margaret felt the words settle between them, not erasing the past, but acknowledging it. That was enough. Life circles back. It always does. Margaret was still 71, still independent, still capable, still a mother, but no longer invisible. And no longer quietly shrinking. She had become inconvenient, and in doing so, she had remembered something important. A house may remember laughter, but a woman remembers her own worth, and that memory is louder than silence. Andrew stayed longer that afternoon than he had in months. He didn't check his watch. He didn't rush through sentences. He sat in the small beige chair across from Margaret and looked around the apartment again, really looked at it this time. The bookshelf neatly organized. The framed photographs on the wall. The small potted plant by the window that had grown taller than she expected. You did all this yourself? He asked quietly. Margaret smiled. Of course I did. There was no bitterness in her voice. Just fact. He nodded slowly, absorbing something he should have known all along. His mother had always done things herself. When Daniel died, she handled the paperwork. When the roof needed repairs, she got 3 quotes and chose the best one. When Andrew's first business idea failed years ago, she had quietly written him a check and told him it wasn't a loan, it was belief. He rubbed his hands together nervously. I feel like I haven't really been here. Margaret didn't rush to comfort him. You haven't, she said gently. The honesty startled him. She wasn't accusing. She wasn't angry. She was simply telling the truth. He swallowed. I thought moving you here meant you'd be taken care of. I am taken care of, she replied. That's not what I meant. She tilted her head slightly. Then what did you mean? Andrew struggled for words. I guess I thought. If you were somewhere safe, I wouldn't have to worry all the time. Margaret considered that. And worrying is uncomfortable, she said. He looked at her, surprised again. Yes. She nodded. So the solution was to move me somewhere that made you less uncomfortable. The room fell quiet. Andrew opened his mouth, then closed it. It wasn't cruelty she saw in his face. It was realization. I didn't think of it like that, he admitted. I know. Margaret stood and walked to the small kitchenette. She poured 2 cups of tea, her movement steady. When you were 5, she began softly, you were afraid of thunderstorms. You used to run into our bedroom at night. Andrew gave a faint smile. I remember. I could have locked the door, she continued calmly. That would have solved the inconvenience. No more interrupted sleep. He looked down. But that wouldn't have solved the fear. She handed him the tea. He took it with both hands. I wasn't afraid, he said quietly. I was busy. Busy can be another kind of fear, Margaret replied. He didn't argue. For the first time, he seemed to see her not as a responsibility, not as a line item on a mental checklist, but as a person sitting across from him. A woman with history. With thought. With memory. A woman who had given him her best years without ever calling it sacrifice. Claire came the following weekend. Alone. She brought no flowers this time. Just herself. They sat on the small couch together, knees nearly touching because of the limited space. Andrew told me you talked, Claire began. We did. Claire hesitated. He feels awful. Margaret sighed gently. That's not necessary. Yes, it is. There was something different in Claire's tone too. Less defensive. More reflective. I didn't realize, Claire said slowly, that we stopped asking what you wanted. Margaret studied her daughter's face. You were trying to be efficient, she said. Claire laughed softly, though her eyes were damp. That sounds like something I'd say. It is something you'd say. Claire wiped her eyes quickly. When Dad died, I didn't know how to fix it. I think. I started trying to fix everything else. Margaret felt her heart soften. Grief had moved through all of them differently. For Margaret, it had been quiet and internal. For her children, it had turned into control. Planning. Managing. Securing. I never asked you if you wanted to leave the house, Claire admitted. No, Margaret said. Claire looked down at her hands. Did you? Margaret took her time before answering. No, she said finally. But I also didn't know how to say no. Claire's breath caught. That sentence carried more weight than anger ever could. The truth was simple. Margaret had been raised to accommodate. To smooth tension. To put others first. And her children, without meaning harm, had stepped into that pattern. They hadn't pushed a strong wall. They had leaned against a soft one. I don't want you to feel like a burden, Claire whispered. Margaret shook her head gently. I don't feel like a burden, she said. I felt like a solution. Claire frowned slightly. What do you mean? You solved for me, Margaret explained. You rearranged me to make life neater. Claire inhaled sharply. And I let you, Margaret added. That part is mine. Silence lingered. Then Claire did something she hadn't done in years. She leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. They sat like that for a long time. Not fixing. Not planning. Just being. Weeks turned into months. Andrew found a new job, less prestigious, but stable. Claire started coming by more often. Not out of obligation. Out of intention. Margaret noticed the difference immediately. They stayed longer. They listened more. They asked her about her library volunteering, about the children she tutored. One Sunday afternoon, Andrew brought the grandchildren. They ran through the community garden laughing. Margaret watched them from a bench, her heart swelling. The space was smaller than her old yard. But the laughter sounded just as bright. Later, as the children played, Andrew sat beside her. Mom, he began cautiously, I've been thinking. That can be dangerous, she teased lightly. He smiled faintly. About the house. Margaret's chest tightened instinctively, but she kept her expression calm. I know we can't undo the sale, he continued. But I don't want you to feel like you were pushed out. She studied him. I was, she said gently. He nodded. I know. There was no defensiveness now. Just acceptance. I can't change that, he said. But I can change how we move forward. Margaret felt something inside her settle. For the first time since the fall on the stairs, she felt heard. Truly heard. You don't have to compensate, she told him. You just have to show up. He swallowed hard. I will. And he did. Not perfectly. Not every week. But consistently. Claire started calling just to chat, not to schedule or coordinate. Andrew began stopping by on random evenings with takeout. The children started asking to visit Grandma's place. Margaret noticed something else too. She no longer waited. She no longer measured her worth by how often the phone rang. Her life had expanded beyond them. The library children adored her. One little girl named Sophia had struggled with reading for months. Margaret worked patiently with her, sounding out words, celebrating small victories. The day Sophia read an entire page without stopping, she threw her arms around Margaret's waist. "You're the best," the child declared. Margaret laughed, surprised by the intensity of her own emotion. She walked home that afternoon lighter than she had in years. Inconvenient. That word no longer stung. It had transformed. It had forced her to choose herself. To build a life that wasn't dependent on being needed. And that changed everything. One evening, Eleanor, the sharp-witted woman she had met early on, knocked on her door. "Family visiting more?" Eleanor asked knowingly. Margaret smiled. "Yes." "Funny how that works," Eleanor said. "What do you mean?" "When they realize you're not waiting, they start coming." Margaret considered that. It wasn't manipulation. It wasn't strategy. It was energy. Neediness creates distance. Wholeness invites connection. "I think they just needed to see me as a person again," Margaret said softly. Eleanor chuckled. Children forget that their parents had lives before them. Margaret nodded. She had been 22 once. She had dreams that had nothing to do with carpools and grocery lists. She had loved Daniel fiercely. She had built a career. She had opinions. Somewhere along the way, she had reduced herself to caretaker. And when that role faded, she hadn't known who she was without it. Until now. The final piece came unexpectedly on a crisp autumn afternoon. Andrew and Claire invited her to Andrew's house for dinner. When she arrived, something felt different. The table was set carefully. Candles lit. The grandchildren seated quietly. Andrew stood up, clearing his throat. "Mom," he began, voice slightly unsteady, "we owe you something." Margaret raised an eyebrow gently. "An apology isn't enough," Claire added. "We can't undo what happened. But we want you to know. We see it now." Andrew continued, "You weren't inconvenient. You were independent. And we mistook that for something that needed managing." Margaret felt her eyes sting. "We were uncomfortable with the idea of losing you," Claire said softly. "So we tried to control it." Margaret took a slow breath. "I never needed control," she replied. "I needed connection." Andrew nodded. "We're working on that." They had framed something on the wall. Margaret turned and saw it. A photograph of her old house. Not as an asset. Not as property. But as memory. Underneath it, in simple script, were the words, "This is where love grew." Margaret pressed her lips together to steady herself. She didn't need the house back. She needed acknowledgement. She walked over and touched the frame gently. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, as she returned to her small beige apartment, she didn't feel displaced. She felt transformed. The house had remembered laughter. The apartment now did too. Her life had not shrunk. It had shifted. She was still a mother. Still a grandmother. Still a woman with stories and strength. She was no longer rearranged to fit someone else's comfort. She was no longer quietly accommodating. She had become inconvenient. And in that becoming, she had found something deeper than convenience. She had found herself. And for the first time in a long time, the silence. The year Margaret turned 73, something shifted again. Not in her body. Not in her children. But in her understanding of time. Time no longer felt like something chasing her. It felt like something walking beside her. She woke earlier than usual on her birthday. The sky outside her window was just beginning to lighten. She didn't reach for her phone. She didn't wait for it to ring. Instead, she made coffee and sat by the window, watching the sun rise slowly over the parking lot and the distant line of trees beyond it. There had been birthdays in the past when she cooked her own cake because everyone else was busy. There had been birthdays when she pretended she didn't care if anyone remembered. This morning felt different. Not because she expected something, but because she didn't. Around 9, there was a knock at her door. She smiled before opening it. Andrew stood there, holding a small box. Claire was behind him with the children, all grinning too widely to be subtle. "Surprise," Claire said softly. Margaret laughed. "I had a feeling," she replied. They came inside, filling the small apartment with noise and warmth. The children hugged her tightly. Andrew handed her the box. Inside was a leather-bound journal. On the first page, written in Claire's handwriting, were the words, "Your stories matter." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "You've always told us stories," Andrew said quietly. "About Grandma. About Dad. About your childhood. About us." Claire nodded. "We realized. We don't know all of them." Margaret ran her fingers over the page. "You want me to write them down?" "We want them to stay," Claire said. "Stay. Not managed. Not minimized. Stay." Margaret closed the journal gently. "I will," she said. They spent the afternoon together, cake, laughter, small arguments over board games. At one point, Margaret stepped back and simply watched. Andrew helping Lily with her math homework at the kitchen table. Claire rinsing dishes, humming absent-mindedly. The children sprawled across the rug. For a moment, she felt a flicker of the old ache, the memory of the larger house, the long dining table, Daniel carving cake while pretending to make dramatic speeches. But the ache didn't consume her. It softened. Because what she had feared losing had not been space. It had been presence. And presence was here. Later, after they left, Margaret opened the new journal and began to write. "I was not inconvenient. I was changing. And change unsettles people who prefer certainty." She paused. The pen hovered over the page. She continued. "My children loved me. They were afraid. I loved them. I was afraid too. We rearranged each other until we remembered who we were." She closed the journal, satisfied for the evening. The weeks that followed carried a gentle rhythm. Margaret began hosting a monthly dinner at the community lounge. Nothing elaborate, just simple meals and storytelling. Residents brought their own dishes. They shared memories. They laughed more loudly than anyone expected. Word spread. Soon, even some family members of other residents began attending. One evening, Eleanor stood up after dessert. "I want to thank Margaret," she announced, her voice firm, "for reminding us that we are not storage. We are history." Applause followed. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. Afterward, Eleanor leaned close and whispered, "You've built something." Margaret smiled. Yes. She had. It wasn't the same as the house. But it was community. It was intention. It was chosen. Meanwhile, Andrew and Claire continued their own quiet transformations. Andrew started attending counseling with Jenna. He learned to sit with discomfort instead of immediately reaching for solutions. Claire began setting firmer boundaries at work. She said no to extra projects. She left the office earlier twice a week. They didn't announce these changes to Margaret. But she saw them. In the way they spoke. In the way they paused before responding. In the way they listened longer. One evening, Andrew sat across from her again, in the same small chair he once viewed as temporary. "I was thinking about the word you used," he said. "Which one?" "Rearranged." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "You said we rearranged you." "I did." He nodded slowly. "I think I rearranged myself too." She waited. "I convinced myself that being efficient was being loving," he admitted. "That solving things quickly meant I cared." Margaret smiled gently. "Efficiency and love are not enemies," she said. "But they are not the same." He absorbed that. "I'm trying to slow down," he said. "That's brave," she replied. He looked surprised. "Slowing down feels like losing control." Margaret nodded. "That's why most people don't do it." The truth was simple. They had all been afraid of slowing down. Afraid of sitting still long enough to feel loss, aging, vulnerability. So they had rushed. And in rushing, they had nearly lost each other. Spring arrived again. Another cycle. Margaret found herself walking through the garden with Lily, who was now tall enough to reach her elbow. "Grandma," Lily asked thoughtfully, "do you think you'll ever move again?" Margaret smiled. "Why?" "Because Mom says life changes all the time." Margaret nodded slowly. It does. So? Lily pressed. Margaret looked around at the blooming flowers, the residents chatting on benches, the soft hum of ordinary life. Maybe, she said. But if I do, it will be my choice. Lily seemed satisfied with that answer. Choice. That was the foundation now. Not fear. Not convenience. Choice. Later that summer, something unexpected happened. Margaret received a letter from the new owners of her old house. They had found her address through the sale documents. Inside the envelope was a photograph. The house, freshly painted again. In the yard stood two young children holding up a banner that read, "First day at our new home." Margaret studied the image for a long time. She expected to feel grief. Instead, she felt something close to gratitude. The house was still holding laughter. Just not hers. And that was all right. She placed the photograph inside her journal. Underneath it, she wrote, "Some homes are chapters, not conclusions." The following Sunday, she invited Andrew and Claire over and showed them the picture. Andrew looked nervous at first. Claire studied her face carefully. Margaret smiled. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. They both relaxed. "You're really okay?" Claire asked. "I am," Margaret replied. She meant it. Because she finally understood something fundamental. The house had never been her identity. Motherhood had never been her only purpose. Being needed had never been the same as being valued. She had mistaken dependence for closeness. And they had mistaken management for care. They were all learning. And learning takes time. That evening, after her children left, Margaret sat on her balcony once more. The sky was streaked with orange and lavender. She thought about the version of herself who had fallen on the stairs and lain there in silence. That woman had felt fragile. Isolated. Afraid of disappearing. This woman felt grounded. Seen. At peace. She had not reversed aging. She had not reclaimed the house. She had not rewritten the past. But she had rewritten her relationship with herself. She no longer measured love by sacrifice. She no longer equated silence with strength. She no longer shrank to fit someone else's comfort. And because of that, her children no longer needed to rearrange her. They met her where she stood. Not as a problem. Not as a project. But as a person. Margaret closed her eyes, breathing in the warm evening air. The world had not grown quieter. She had grown clearer. And clarity is louder than fear. If someone had asked her now what she feared most, she would not have said aging. She would not have said loneliness. She would have said losing herself. But she no longer feared that either. Because she had found herself once. She could do it again. The word inconvenient had once felt like an erasure. Now it felt like a threshold. It had pushed her to step forward. To claim space. To demand understanding without raising her voice. To love without dissolving. And as the first stars appeared overhead, Margaret smiled softly to herself. She had become inconvenient. And in doing so, she had become whole.